And, you know, it's been very interesting to ask the same or similar questions to each group. Of course, only us, we have heard the answers, so you don't know what the other people said, so that gives you sometimes an advantage or not. But we've been talking a lot about, each one of us has been describing how did you come to the realization, did you come to the realization that you don't need weekly lessons? One of the subtopics, one of the big subtopics of this festival is, for me, is how can these, you know, really, really gifted people who have so much talent and potential come into their own and become less dependent on that fix of, oh, my lesson is on Thursday. And whatever is wrong will get straightened out, or, you know, I'll get the next episode. The one, for me, the most interesting response so far was Jerry Lowenthal's response, which was, oh, I was so excited to get rid of my teacher. I couldn't wait, so I became a French major. So, you know, everybody's had a different journey, and obviously it's usually not like you wake up one day and you say, well, I don't need lessons anymore. So I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about how you made that transition so that you could work on your own, prepare on your own, play on a professional level without assistance. Who wants to go first? I nominate you, Arthur, since you just played. You go first.
Me first?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think back. I mean, I finished my doctoral program and finished school, and there were no more lessons. But I did search out other people, and I mean, I wanted to play for such and such pianist, and so I did that just to get different points of view. I don't know. I mean, I don't like the way I was thinking back then. So I don't think that whatever answer that I gave to this would be really, I wouldn't recommend anyone being in my state of mind back at that point. But I do think that there should always, I mean, it depends on the way that the teacher is relating to you. If the teacher is telling you, you know, how to play every phrase, then you better stop at a certain point. But a different thing could be that the teacher is a listener, like an audience, and tells you their impression. Like, I feel that, you know, you're blocked of your expression in a certain way. Well, that kind of lesson I could still appreciate having. It's a little bit awkward now to do that, but I mean, or you could ask. I find it's difficult to find people to play for, and I play for my wife, but other than that, it's difficult. And having a teacher that you really respect is someone that you can play for, and that's really important. So that could happen at any time.
Well, you know, I was thinking back, and I was fortunate in undergraduate to have some peers that we were sort of like-minded, and I was finding very early on, we would play for each other all the time. I mean, Friday nights, you'd find me not out at the clubs, but in the studio with a peer, you know, comparing our Liszt concertos or whatever. And so I think I never, even in the college years, felt married to that weekly piano lesson, that there was so much other input that was coming from peers. And then in my graduate work, I was finding that a lot of input was coming from string players, colleagues. I was realizing that wind players, string players, there's just so much extracurricular musical discussion that can happen that's not pianistically related. So I guess I always thought that weekly lessons weren't the center of what I was doing. It was definitely important and so forth. But I guess so on our journey, as we're doing chamber music, as we're playing for colleagues, if there's, you know, concerts coming up, might play for a colleague, would they play the second piano part before a concerto or something. It just seemed like it was a very natural process to go from that nest, that safe teacher's nest, but always having the input from colleagues. So I think it feels very organic. I don't know that I ever had a moment where it stopped.
This particular group, the students that I've taught, which is almost everybody now, they don't trust themselves to completely finish a work and play. And I'm not, of course, it's nice to have friends, colleagues, even your dog or your cat, or, you know, but sometimes you're alone. And when I was growing up, we didn't have things like this. There was really no way to record yourself. I mean, very few people had tape recorders. And not everybody had a huge library. Anyway, you couldn't really hear yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a lot more technology. So maybe this is the week where everybody felt that there was no difference between being a student and stepping into the real world, or suddenly, you know, the transition of 1 week you're a student, the next week you have a job because there were so many jobs, and so then you just switch over. But a lot of the people here are afraid a little bit to finish by themselves, and they need that stamp.
Can I just add one thing to that, is that I think it's a mistake to come to a teacher and expect them to tell you how to play the piece or how something should go. And maybe that's the problem, if you can't do that on your own. I mean, you have to find out how you want to play the piece, and then the teacher will tell you, well, that sounds bad, you know, you shouldn't do it. That's something different. But just to have this idea that you have to always be fed what to play, then what's the point of even being a pianist?
But our educational system is like, education is the television set. The student sits in front of the television set, and there is no way that the student is taught to transition from a student to a teacher. You're just supposed to either figure that out or hocus pocus dominocus. I mean, you were fortunate because you had this dialogue going on. So what do you feel about this, Jose?
I think I sort of agree with both. I just want to maybe bring attention to very important the relationship that you have with your teacher. And you know, we all have many teachers, and then there's that one last teacher, and that's when that moment comes. So it depends on what kind of relationship you have and what was your attitude during your formative years. I find that for some students, they place so much importance on the teacher as the solver of all problems. So we have to be mentors, we have to be guides, we have to be many things. But actually, being a student, remembering back in my time as a student, the teacher was a guide, was a helper, was definitely a very important piece, but we had to take ownership of our own musical education. It was not just up to the teacher to form everything. And there were certain teachers that were actually kind of aloof about it, and perhaps with good reason. They would just simply ask you to take responsibility, find out by yourself, don't. So I guess it depends. For me, it was sort of like a natural process. Partly, yeah, finishing your degree, your final degree. Also, my teacher at the time, Mr. Schein, was kind of like phasing out of teaching himself. But I found myself doing more teaching myself and more performing than having the time to go and take a lesson. However, I always relish the opportunity to play for someone whom I might respect and try to get that feedback. So I think not a weekly lesson, obviously. At one point in time, you have to trash your training, you have to assimilate the concepts and put them into practice. I think most students, even the ones sitting here, so talented and so gifted, they know many more things than they think they do. It's just that they haven't had to go inside and actually apply those things that they already know. And then what happens is that when they finally start realizing that, they lose that kind of dependency and say, you know what? I remember what so-and-so told me at the Rebecca Penneys Festival. Let's do that, right?
You all should be teaching, because that's a really wonderful thing that will help you. Are you all teaching? Raise your hand if you have private students. Okay. That's good.
That's great.
Would you like to say something?
Yeah, well, actually, I think you should all, as you're learning, also feel that you're teaching yourselves, because that's part of a natural process. And it's so easy now. I have a friend from Israel who comes to the United States and he gives master classes all over the States and he goes back to Israel. And I asked him once, what his process was with this, because he's basically a professional master class teacher. And he said, well, I go on YouTube, and I know whatever they're going to hear, and there's master classes for all of these pieces on YouTube. And I listen to all these master classes, and then of course I think what I think anyway. But actually I thought that was so clever. Because I don't know how many of you have done that, but if you look up the piece that you're playing, Beethoven's Sonata Opus 109 Masterclass, on YouTube, you'll find tremendous, and it's free lessons, I actually sort of stopped having lessons because my teacher at Juilliard died, and I went to another teacher who was a very famous woman teacher who was sort of a monster, and I didn't get along with her, and so we sort of agreed that I would just sort of come very seldom for lessons, and then I thought I was sort of done with teaching. I was starting to play or whatever, and I moved to France, and all of a sudden my eyes were opened, and I had a whole new sort of teacher there with Yvan Lefebvre, who was the sort of the French way, and then eventually I had, as you said, there's very often we have a last teacher, a final teacher. In my case, it was Leon Fleischer. And I felt during those 3 years with him that this was the end. I mean, that I was being given at that point between everything I'd had and what he was showing me. I felt that I sort of had ways of understanding music and of approaching things and finding answers to things that maybe I didn't know. But I think, I wish that I had somebody to play for every once in a while now. I learn a lot from conductors when I play concertos, from string players when I play chamber music. But there comes a time, and you're teaching yourself. I mean, I feel like every time I play a concert, it's a lesson for me. If it's a new piece, I have to play it, put it away. Play it, put it away. Maybe the third time I come back to that piece, then I feel like maybe I own that piece. Things take time. But I think you have to feel, as you're studying, that you're also teaching yourself. You have to develop how to be analytical, how to hear analytically, how to look at your hands and see what you're doing and why something isn't working. A lot of it is just common sense, I think, teaching, And the more you start to do that for yourself, absolutely, the more you can do it. You should all be teaching if for no other reason. It's the most money you're going to make right now. I mean, it's better than any job. And you'll learn, and you're learning the whole process of how to get along with people. But, yeah, I think
the
it's a
other thing
process.
is, it's so easy to record yourself.
Yeah.
You don't need like a Zoom recorder or something that's pretty good. And that's another whole dimension of teaching, because I don't think that most people, including myself, when I hear myself play, I don't jump up and down and say, oh, boy, isn't that great? I say, gee, that was nice, or why did I do that? Or you listen to CDs that you made 10 years ago and you think, what was I thinking? Or sometimes it's, oh, that's pretty good. But, nobody's perfect here. And so, that is a really nice way of adding information or adding emotion to your playing or adding dynamics, or, you'll get just immediate feedback.
Recording is extremely, the studio recordings that I've done, I feel like I'm getting a lesson every second, listening to a playback, deciding why I'm going to choose this as opposed to that, and what works. And yeah, just even sometimes I'll take my iPad and just record something, and you learn so much. It's painful, but you learn.
Yeah, would you like to say something?
Well, I'm overwhelmed by all these wonderful things and articulate teachers. I came fairly late to teaching, but I came maybe too early to performing. And I can talk about my teachers because I'm at my knees with the ones that guided me with not too much verbal eloquence. Instinctive, finding each individual, enlightening the composer's voice on the page, letting you become yourself, your individuality, without too much fuss. Maybe those that I've heard here can tell that I'm very much like that. I want to connect with each individual, first for their voice, and then what is the composer's voice telling us. Now, my first teacher I had at the age of 4. My parents chose really well. This was in Chicago, which at that time, I'm very old, so you've got to go way back to the Second World War years. She and her husband were very erudite musicians in Chicago. They had a music school, Dr. Glenn Dillard Gunn and his wife. They had both been students, advanced students in Europe with Busoni and Arthur Friedheim. And they were absolutely incredibly widely educated, cultured. They knew all the great artists of the day. They even knew the Mary Garden, who was the first singer in Debussy's opera. They knew her personally. They had pictures all over their apartment. And so the first half an hour of those lessons from 4 to 13 were talking. I'd hear my parents and them discussing the concerts they heard and the artistry of this person, and even photographs. I was absolutely riveted to this whole aura that was given to me before I played a note.
But, you know, the question we're trying to address here is how did you separate yourself from lessons? You know, like your last teacher? Who was your last teacher? How did you stop having lessons? Or did you stop having
Well, I'll go
lessons?
fast from where I was.
Okay, quick.
13, Mieczysław Mundz, great artist, great Polish, terrible tragedy in his life, but he ended up in this country. He said to my parents when I played for him, I don't know what I played or how I did, he said, would you give me 3 to 5 years? I think she's going to have a very long life in music. It's very few words from him, from 13 to 5 years it turned out. By the time 5 years was over, I was into performing in a very heavy way, in a very wonderful way. And my parents nurtured the naturalness of my going to school, having friends, producing Swan Lake at the age of 10 with no laughter from anybody, because I had seen these great dancers. I had been surrounded by a lot of gorgeous artistic culture. Now, it may not be everybody's experience, but I performed until I was 40 years old when I had the invitation to teach at Peabody Conservatory. And I had needed 2 letters of recommendation, and my teachers had been Mieczysław Mundz until that time, coaches Arthur Rubinstein, Myra Hess, Beveridge Webster, and Menahem Pressler. Pretty nice. And I learned and absorbed from all of them. I still do, from old recordings, from gorgeous collections of really great art. And my family had subscriptions to concerts from the time I was little, live concerts in Washington, D.C., where we heard all of these artists every week. Now that's something we don't have today. And when I started to teach, I said to my beautiful letter writers, Beveridge Webster and Menahem Pressler, how do I do this? And they smiled. They said, you will love it. There's no book you're going to read. It's just you start and you love each day. It took one student for me to blast the roof off like lightning of excitement. There was the music, there was this individual and me. There was this magic circle. And you talk about the music because the composer is talking to you. So how to get through that individual, first you got to know the individual pretty well, which I found out pretty quickly, and I love that. I love that connection with each individual, because that's what communicates with an audience, is your voice and the composer's. So that's about all I can say, that the initial teaching experience only took one student for me to absolutely have a passion for this circle. And I think it was a point in my life, having started performing when I was 17 and never stopped, still haven't, and I hope it goes on some more. But the teaching certainly gave a moment in my life where I was going to start learning. And the composer was going to teach me through each individual more and more of my repertoire and repertoire. I had the courage to teach the repertoire that I had never done myself. Some teachers don't do much of that, but it's all giving to you, the music. And I continue to have a passion, first for the composer's voice, and a lesson every single time you give a lesson or give a performance. It never ends. It's like loaves and fishes. So I'm irrepressibly enthusiastic. But I think today, with our technology and our educational problems that we're having these days with the, oh my goodness, I mean, there's so much confusion and things happen so fast. And it's not the life I was given early to experience everything in a much slower pace. And after 10 years at Peabody, I could tell when the technology came in that suddenly the concentration of the students was interrupted, and there was things were happening very fast, and it was much more lack of deep concentration and time to think. And I think it's getting worse now, much worse.
So I just want to see if any of the students have any questions.
Yeah.
Would you, any of you like to ask a question about anything?
No one else does?
No questions?
I have one.
Okay.
You know, the one thing of
She
all...
has a question.
Oh, great.
So if you are stuck in a jail,
If you're in jail?
and yes, for the rest of your life, and that you are, all the life and everything, food is taken care of, but you get to listen to one pianist, and one pianist only, for the rest of your life, who would that be?
That's the desert island question.
Yes,
Who would you take with you? Right?
yes.
Oh, is she asking us or?
Yeah.
She's asking,
Pick one pianist that there's no more music, no other entertainment, no.
and you don't have a piano yourself.
No, you can't play. You don't have a CD player, no YouTube. Just one pianist for the rest.
What's the
of your
point?
life.
I guess, why are we in jail instead of a desert island? At least we have the sunshine.
Imagine that. Yeah, directly.
This just is a way to give narrow down.
Well, it makes a huge difference in how you think. Where you're not getting anything, or if you're on like a small island, like St. Thomas Island, and you're left there, then you can listen to the sound of the ocean, you can
That's
communicate
fine.
with the fish and the birds. And you don't necessarily have to take anybody.
That's
Because
why-
how can you take anybody when you won't have anything to play it on anyway?
Practical. What if you do have something to play? Could I tell Rubenstein's story about that? I encountered Mr. Rubenstein after the age of 60, closer to 80, and he'd had his whole life. And he once shared with me the one thing that he would take with him if it was a desert island. And he had narrowed it down to Schubert and to the two-cello quintet. He said, I don't want anything else but that. And then my husband, quartet, he asked them to come and play in his living room in Paris. And he said, I'm at your feet with Mozart. I want to sit right in the middle of you and hear this Mozart quintet all around me. And he was sobbing. So I just leave you with those thoughts.
I love it.
How about another question?
No!
This might be a very broad question, but
Can you speak louder?
yeah, this might be a broad question, but how has when you first started teaching, what were some difficulties you were facing? Like, and did you learn from how you were learning from? Did you learn to teach from your own teacher?
Well, I remember the student who came into my room at Peabody. He looked like Van Cliburn. He was about 6'4", blonde, from Texas. and he played the third Chopin scherzo. And I had played the scherzo, and I had been taught by several of these people, and it was very good, extremely good. I don't remember what I said, but I'm sure some of that input that had been given to me by hearing and being taught by the teachers fed into what could it maybe improve something. I didn't say, well, you don't know what you're doing. Like Mr. Rubinstein said to me, I played I think the fourth ballade, and he said, it's very clear you know nothing about Chopin. He said, but we'll work on it. And he certainly did.
Is your question about you don't know what to say, or you say something and you don't get a result? Have you taught at all?
Yeah, yeah.
So what are you referring to? Like, can you give an example?
I guess being able to give the student what they need the most, because every student is different, and I thought that was the most difficult part for me to have. Sort of.
One of the most important qualities a teacher should have, a successful teacher, is to be a good psychologist, you know, because you're exactly right that each of you, each of us is different. It needs to be handled differently, massaged differently, manipulated, encouraged differently. That's an important part of teaching, getting good results.
So I have a question for you. What do you expect when you go for a lesson? I mean, when are you ready to play for your teacher? You know, there are different levels. Like, you can just be, oh, I have a lesson to do, so I'll just take this in. I know it isn't very good, but I'll just drag it in there anyway and get some direction. Or you have to be really ready. One of the things I really, really appreciated about Mr. Shumwick is he made this unwritten rule with me, is every week I had to play something different, and every time I came in, I had to be memorized. He insisted that I play a performance with him. So that was, kept me really busy, because it's hard to play, you know, and then he said, you're going to play 5 recitals a semester, but you can't repeat anything. Well, that was, you know, really, it was a really great training, because it was a question of focus and discipline, and yeah, he expected that level. So part of it starts with what your expectations are for yourself.
So, if I could just, you know, I think knowledge builds confidence, and I remember having some experiences to play for Mitsuko Uchida when she was living in London. And she had a very strong work ethic. In every hour that she was at the instrument, she would spend another hour then on her futon. So an hour in play, our futon. And her biggest point is that the knowledge that she gained from the score during that hour when she wasn't dealing with technical things, but really honing in on texture, harmony, score, what is this composer doing? Like Anne said, you know, our job is really to be the filter for the composer. So I think you have to trust what's on the page, trust the composer, spend a lot of time away from the keyboard, kind of dissecting what is it that you're supposed to be communicating. And then number one, you have a little bit more focus to the practicing. You're not just thinking, what is my teacher going to think I should do here? You're actually saying to yourself, well, what is the composer asking me to do here? And I think the more you develop that relationship with the score, the teacher becomes supplementary in a way, and your relationship is really to who's created this original material to begin with. And I think then the fear sort of starts going away. You become bolder the more you get to know. Another great project to develop a more bold feel for a composer is taking a year where maybe Beethoven is your composer, and you listen from the first opus to the last opus of all the genre, but going opus by opus, and start to connect the threads as you listen to opus 1, the piano trios, and then you listen to opus 2, the piano sonatas, and you start going through the symphonies, string quartets, and you start really developing an understanding not just for what's in the piano sonatas, but what is this composer really developing in his own or her own voice. And then you become the conduit for that. And I think fear goes away in many ways. your responsibility rises way above fear in certain ways. Maybe your fear that you're not bringing enough to what the composer originally wanted, but I don't know if that
Sounds great.
Another question?
Yeah, so I think being knowledgeable and like reading is also very important in part of like being a musician. So I'm wondering like how would you like choose the books to read and explore the music knowledge? Because for me, like sometimes when I walk into the library, I don't exactly know like which books I should choose to read or like because there are a lot. Yeah, so I'm wondering like, if you have any suggestions, or like there's certain books like you highly recommend us to read as a pianist.
It depends on what you're interested in particularly. I mean, you have to look at the different books, or actually you could even go on Amazon and read all the reviews. There are a lot of very intelligent reviews there to just see what the book is about, what slant the author takes, and what you feel brings the music out of you. I mean, I could recommend something interesting for me. I don't know, I mean, a lot of people don't like this book, but it's about Beethoven. It's called Beethoven and His Nephew, a Psychoanalytic Study. And this book is out of print. You can find it on Amazon for $2, an old tattered copy of it. And it's written by a couple who were psychiatrists, and I read that, and I felt like, I mean, a lot of people don't like it because it seems almost, well, it's critical of Beethoven, makes him look bad. But actually, I mean, to me, it doesn't make him look bad. It makes it look like he had a lot of troubles to work through, and his life was very difficult, but it's real. And it shows you, you know, what he was feeling and his relationship with, and his distortions of his relationships. And anyway, something like that, for me, it's more interesting than reading just a story of a list of all the things that happened in his life or other people's thoughts about his music.
You know, well, I'm just a little troubled here because these questions have a little bit of the tinge of how do you know what to choose? How do you know what to say? And you can't know what to do before you do it. You know, you can't just have the answer before the process. So you have to be open. You walk in and you say, I mean, if you don't know, you want a good book to read and it doesn't even need to be about music. Let's say you want to make a pie. Okay, and you never made a pie before. So you can, in the olden days, there used to be, your mother had a recipe book or your friend had a recipe book and there would be a few pie recipes. And so you see the essence of how to make a pie. Nowadays you go to Google and in 5 minutes you get like more pie recipes than you're ever going to need in your life. And you just choose one and the pie might be good. You might not be able to follow the recipe. It might be terrible. But, you know, so it's like that. So when you give a piano lesson, you can't plan what you're going to say before you hear the person. Whether you know the piece or you don't know the piece, or whether you play the piece or you don't know the piece. I mean, you know something. So you need that interaction, and then you just go from there. So you don't be afraid of the unknown. That's the whole idea. When you sit down to perform something, even if you know and play the Chopin ballades for 40 years, so you don't know exactly what's going to happen. I mean, there is no way to guarantee that it's all going to go the way you hope and dream. Stuff happens. And so the point of it is almost that, yes, go into the adventure. That will lead you to another. So I'm trying so hard to get you to unlock that whole part of the house that you haven't stepped foot in. I don't know what's in there any more than you do. I don't know what's in there for myself. That's why it's such a joy to sit down and play the piano every day, or to learn new music every day, because I'm curious to see, well, what is tomorrow going to bring? It's, you know, it's a gift. Every day is a huge gift. So don't take that element of surprise away.
Yeah, you have to explore and take the time to explore. And then some things aren't going to be interesting. So if you start a book that you realize this is nonsense, and you don't
Don't
read the
finish
rest of it and find something else.
And it doesn't matter if so-and-so said, oh, I really like that book. You can say, well, I didn't. I mean, there's room for all of that. So you can have, I mean, I used to say to students, there's positive and negative learning. And there's things that you like from a teacher, even though you can love your teacher to death, but your teacher can tell you something that you don't like. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. You should, but you don't have to accept everything. You have to sort it out. It has to become part of you. And you're all able to do that. So my hope, my big, 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 big hope is that you start to do that.
Yeah, for me the short answer is read them all.
It's what is what?
Read them
all.
Yes, knowledge.
When I came from Spain and I was at Manhattan School of Music, I had never been in a place that had a music library. So for the first 2 months, I didn't even know there was a library in the third floor of the building. And so then I got lost out of the elevators one day and I ended up in the library. And I opened the door and all of a sudden there were all these books there. And I thought, oh, this is wonderful. I think what happens to your generation is that you have an overwhelming amount of information at your disposal extremely quickly. So then you get a little bit overwhelmed by the sheer amount of choices that you have. And then you just go like, okay, so I have so many choices. Well, at one point in time, you just have two approaches. Either you do what Professor Greene said, what am I interested in? Okay, I'm interested in this, this, and this, let's try this. Or you just say, hey, I'm gonna start in this shelf, and I'm gonna read all of it. And it doesn't mean that you have to finish them all, like he said, if you're not interested, then well. But I think self-reflection is what's not, for those that are starting to teach, you were taught since you were children. You have had many teachers, you have attended festivals, you have played in master classes. You have basically had an incredible wealth of knowledge and the how to teach because you've been taught yourself. So you can model your own teaching based on what you thought it was valuable, what you like, what you thought it was effective. And then I totally agree with Rebecca. At the end of the day, there comes that day where, okay, you're the teacher and you don't know what's going to happen until you hear the student. There are some people out there that might teach the piece more than they teach the student. Personally, I teach the student through the piece, or the piece, or the, I don't know. It's kind of like interactive. So I cannot think, okay, I'm going to teach Opus 110. No, I'm going to see how this person plays Opus 110 and see how I can help. For me, the act of teaching started as a helping act because I was a student and other students would knock on my door and complain that they had rough lessons and cry and they were in pain, sometimes in physical pain. So I was just trying to help, and that's really how my teaching started. So just think it that way, you're helping.
But while we're on the subject of books, so I have a book for you. It's called The Midnight Library. It's about life, I would say. You should read it. And you can tell me if you read it all or if you don't like it or whatever, but look it up. It's a very, very interesting book.
I think underneath all this that we're trying to talk about is the idea that a lot of students seem to be on the wrong track. And so what is the right track and the wrong track? The right track is, what is it about you that's the most valuable thing? And that is that you're unique. And there's never been anyone in history like you, or you've never been before and never again. So your uniqueness is what we value. And so that's what you need to nurture. And that's the only reason why you're going to people are going to want to listen to you as a pianist, or why you're going to be successful really, is because if you can develop that, you have to find that and develop that. And the thing that's wrong is to be so afraid of all the things that you have to do because they're daunting and, you know, there's so many things. It's true, you have to learn the notes, you have to learn how to the phrase and all that, and there's so many things. If you get overwhelmed by that and only think about what you have to do, then you'll never have a chance to actually develop who you are. But each one of you is unique, and that's the most valuable thing you have.
Yes.
So when you have students who are approaching interpretation of a piano piece, what do you think are some of the most common misunderstandings that these students have when trying to translate the composer's message onto the piano?
Do you have students?
I don't have students, so.
So listen, I would say, what I want to say is go out and get some students and answer your own question. Because there's a lot of answers to this question. Depends on the student's background, depends on the level of the student, whether this is, you know, a young child or a beginning, what if you have a beginning adult? So to say I mean, in a way, it kind of dumbs the whole subject down by saying what are the most common, because there aren't common things. We just got finished saying everybody's different and unique, and everybody has, you know, education in one place or not so much education in another. It's very uneven. So I guess I'm going to throw back at you, why are you asking the question?
Because I'm curious, for example, from a sample size of certain, I was thinking more along the lines of undergraduate and graduate students, and from a particular sample size of some misunderstandings, perhaps that could apply to interpretations of composers.
I think the misunderstanding is that students don't go out and do this process of self-discovery themselves. That is the biggest weakness, that there's got to be curiosity, but it's not necessarily followed through. And that's how to self-nurture.
I have a question about like maybe your first job, or for students that are trying to get a job after they graduate. What makes people stand out? Like you guys are hiring, or like what made it? Like how did you guys get your first job?
That's probably very varied, but what makes a person stand out is that their voice. You can hear their voice at the instrument and their personality, right, and their presence. And I'm sure everybody got a job because of that. I mean, if you're a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy, that's not very interesting.
And then once you get the job, the most important thing that you, in order not to feel overwhelmed and scared all the time, is to know a lot of repertoire. And, you know, everyone should be, as soon as possible, starting to read through a lot of things and really know the repertoire. Because if you just know the few pieces you played on your senior recital and you have to teach, then it's a nightmare.
You know, I might comment that you mentioned about the misunderstandings. I would have to say understanding of style, stylistic traditions. And if someone comes in, you know, playing even maybe Schumann like Chopin or Chopin like Schumann, I mean, you know, they're very different composers from the same style period. But I guess that goes with my comment before about really immersing yourself in a wider genres, you know, and you can tell whether students have taken the time to go hear the orchestra down the street, or the Cleveland Orchestra, or whatever is down the street. You know, have they taken time to absorb the more peripheral things to understand the basic knowledge of the stylistic traditions of the pieces they're bringing in? And then just to touch on Professor Greene's comment about uniqueness, I think in so many ways we don't always trust our own intuition and our own inner voice. And I think just in terms of what literature to choose, there's just so much out there. But if you think about it, we're all such different entities. What you just did an hour ago is a completely thing than what anyone else in the room just did. And you're changing from hour to hour. We're just like this. So I think as you're going to a library, as you're going to the bookstore, as you're going to these online, there's so many different newsletters you can get per week that show you different, things. Read the reviews. There are just such a wide variety, and just gravitate toward what you're interested in. I mean, you want to develop as full thoughtfulness as possible, whether you read little poetry and then you hit on a historical fiction book, and then maybe an incredible current event, something that's really happening that you're taking a stake on, that you're really kind of trying to develop your own belief in something that in society is really important right now. That will reflect in your playing. So I think a variety of genres in the reading in literature is just as important as in the listening.
I mean, in a way, we have too much choice now. That's
No,
the thing. Like, you
it's
go into the
overwhelming,
grocery
like I
store,
said.
and, we don't need to have 50 different kinds of peanut butter. The no stir, the organic, the this, the that, the other thing. And I know that it's overwhelming when you do that, but, you have to find a way to pick and choose. And you have to sort of make guidelines for yourself and weed out this and weed out that. And some of the reasons might be arbitrary. I mean, but it doesn't matter. You can't pick everything because you will go crazy. And we all have to do that.
One thing that, in order to be a teacher, you have to be opinionated. You cannot be a teacher and not be opinionated. Now, maybe at one point in time you'll have students that don't need you to take them by the hand, and they have their own personality, and they can even argue with you about what they're doing, and they might have actually very valid points, and that's a great thing to do, but you do have to have your own opinion. And so if you don't have strong opinions, it's either because of lack of real love for what you're doing, or because of fear that you might have the wrong opinion. You still have to stand up for something.
That's exactly right.
You still have to have your opinion. And then you have to be able to communicate that opinion. You have to have some kind of articulate way in which you can, and that's when you connect with other human beings. You have to do it through being able to communicate. Some people do it by playing for their students. Some people do it by explaining things more intellectually. Some people do a mixture of, you have to find your own style, what you can do well, and it's a little bit of trial and error. You see that this student responds better when you play for them. This other student doesn't do that, and you need to explain things more in more detail without playing. So it varies with the student, but if you have a strong opinion, if you're willing to communicate, and then if you love the act of helping discover this amazing piece of art with the student, and you have that generosity, that kindness of giving that knowledge, wanting to give that knowledge, then eventually you're going to become a good teacher.
I agree with everything you said, and I think that these days somehow, I mean, even though there's so much strife and conflict in a lot of ways in the world, people are too careful, really, and they don't like to get in kind of arguments about style or something like that. And so someone will say something, and then you might think something different, but you have to keep it to yourself. I wish it weren't like that. I wish we could feel comfortable kind of arguing with each other and then working things out like some kind of dialectic, and you might end up changing your mind.
Yeah, it's also okay to say, gee, I said this to you 2 weeks ago or whatever,
Right.
but I've changed my mind. I think I made a mistake, or I have a better idea now. So when you're practicing, that's what goes on. You don't just, I hope, repeat the same thing over and over. Because, yeah, in the process of practicing, you're going to discover different phrasing, different paddling, fingering, everything, and that's what should be happening. It's an evolution. Anybody else? Yes?
So there are lots of piano competitions, small and big, taking place all over right now. It's very competitive. And I may ask what's your recommendation in terms of like preparation, and how do you decide about the contestants, and based on your experience, were there some some good, healthy competitions and bad competitions. And what did you get from it, out of it?
What was the end? What?
Like, what did you learn?
Do you mean competitions that we were participants in?
Judging or participants in?
Or preparing students? What do you mean?
Actually, my question was for both. Like, when you judge a competition, what do you look for? And when you have students that you're encouraging to join competitions, how do you prepare them along with your accommodations?
It's a gigantic question. I would just say one thing. Every time I'm on an international competition jury and I'm talking with my colleagues, the other judges, and I ask them, what's the most important thing for you? I've asked this question to any number of people, and everybody says the same thing, the answer. It's sound. That's what everybody says, because everything starts with sound. We work in sound, that's our universe. And it's true, sometimes you'll hear a parade of pianists playing the same piano, and why they have such a horrible piano here, or blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden somebody comes in and they have that sound, and the piano is irrelevant all of a sudden, that's just a tiny sliver of an answer for part of your question. But
I spend most of my time with the people who don't get the first prize, or second, or third, because they all have a voice, and they all have played really well enough to be in the competition. And I am very aware of the lack of, at the age usually, they're entering the competition. They're not quite formed, like we're talking, where the individuality is forming. And they could be easily put off by, oh, I didn't win the first prize, or I didn't get this, I must be a failure. So my specialty is, of course, hoping that the judges are going to be together enough to pick good winners and good communicators and musicians. But I'm also aware of the others who are not going to get that. My teacher did at 13, did an about face. I had won an interlocking competition at 13, and that's what led me to him. Then I entered another one in my city of Washington, and it was all instruments, including James Levine, age 12, playing Mozart, Eric Friedman playing Brahms concerto. It was a mishmash, and the judges were the orchestra. We were all eliminated, all of us that have gone on, and really good people did win. But my teacher then said to my family, that's the last time she does this. And I have existed all these years as a judge and a teacher, and I'm very happy in that role because I know that there are many, many who are worthy of the first prizes. And so that's my specialty, is the people who may feel inadequate having not gotten the prize, but should not feel that way at all. Should feel the confidence that's growing in them, that they have a voice that counts. It's my contribution.
I feel like, of course I entered competitions, I won some, lost some. I improved so much more after losing a competition. And every time I won something, my playing would get worse.
Is this any answer to your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But I also feel that there's this ideal vision that students have that, how the piece should go. It used to be like on the CD. How if you find it on a CD, the piece goes like that. Or how the judges will think. As if there's some kind of a group of this magical people who are judges and they're different from everybody else. I mean, you could end up being a judge, anyone could be a judge, and everyone has different opinions. But the problem is that the way it works in competitions, there's something about the voting that it usually ends up that the middle people kind of win. Just because certain people get eliminated, it's just a kind of a mathematical
Numbers.
That's the problem. It's not because judges are looking for boring playing, but that's the result, unfortunately.
But it's also, there are some competitions that people are judging and they're not even, there's no discussion, they're not even in the same room, they're doing it, well, now by Zoom. And so it's impossible, and there's no really guidelines, so it's just all over the place. And I think that, you know, it's like gambling. So if you win a competition, that's great. If you don't win a competition, that's also great. It doesn't mean anything about your future because nobody that has any kind of performing/teaching career has made it because they won the such and such competition. It's an accumulation of a lot of years of playing and a lot of experience. And if you win some money along the way, I mean, that's the first time I went in to gamble, and yeah, I won big. And I never went in to gamble again. Take your money and run. It was just luck. I mean, it's not that it's only luck, but there's an element of the chips have to fall right.
You know, I think competitions are great motivators for deadlines, right? And we all function, I think most of us function well if we have a deadline to prepare for. But as Rebecca was saying, I think it's important to keep a perspective that really there's no control of the results. And most often than not, you can't really figure out what happened. It is what it is in many cases. But I think if you're preparing for a competition, at the same time, you're preparing recitals that you play for competitions, and they're just as equally important. You know, I think if you can see a competition as one of the recitals that you're preparing for, I think that's really healthy. And I think also, as you're designing your repertoire, two things as you're moving and designing your repertoire for competitions, look like, you know, this stuff's all published fairly well in advance for the bigger competitions and even the sort of, you know, more regional. Find what repertoire they're looking for, and even a couple years out, start choosing repertoire with your teacher that would work well for you personally, what shows your strengths artistically and technically, what you're excited about, because you'll be performing this for a while. But I think see the long term and also have, you know, short-term goals in the meantime. And then the other thing is, it's really easy to get stuck on repertoire. You know, if you do have, okay, this 2-year goal or whatever, and you're only going to perform, that's limiting. And you have to be careful at your age that you don't just get limited or married to a one recital program, because as everyone said earlier, and Mr. Greene, it's so important to just crank through repertoire at your age. What was it? Sergei Babian, my colleague, said, I think after age 30, we're kind of, we should know all the repertoire that we possibly can, you know, after that point. But I think it's great, that as much as you can read and listen to. But have 2 tracks. Have one kind of competition repertoire that you keep refining and maintaining, and then sort of study pieces that you may or may not perform, but that you're gaining a great deal, either artistically or technically or both from.
Okay, so I think we're going to end this. We have also short-term and long-term goals. We have to get through the day and get finished with everything so we can get to the restaurant in time for dinner before they close. So with that in mind, we'll see you tonight.